Welcome to this edition of the Times Techies webinar series. My name is Sujit John, and I have with me my colleague Shilpa Fadnis. The two of us will moderate this discussion. Our discussion today is on containers and Kubernetes, two really happening technologies. They are related. Kubernetes is used to manage containers, and we'll hear a lot more on that during the discussion. As we move into a multi-cloud world, these technologies are becoming even more important. We'll also discuss the career opportunities in this space and what you need to learn to become experts in Kubernetes. To discuss all this, we have two senior executives from the two companies that have the biggest Kubernetes businesses in the world, Red Hat and VMware. We have with us Ameeta Roy. Ameeta is Director of Solution Architecture at Red Hat India. She is responsible for providing technical leadership and direction to a team of solution architects that is engaged with clients and partners to bring the power of open source technologies to enterprises. Ameeta has been with Red Hat for a little more than 2 years. Prior to Red Hat, Ameeta was at Oracle India. And prior to that, Ameeta was 14 years with IBM. So she's now kind of back in IBM since Red Hat was acquired by IBM 2 years ago. Ameeta, I noticed from your LinkedIn profile that you joined Red Hat almost the same month that IBM announced the acquisition of Red Hat. Any sheer coincidence?
Sheer coincidence. Sheer coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah.
So welcome, Ameeta.
Thank you.
We also have with us Murad Wagh. Murad is Director of Systems Engineering at VMware India. Murad is responsible for the pre-sales functions. He comes with deep experience and expertise in data center automation, virtualization, and cloud technologies, infrastructure management, and cross-management domain architectures. Prior to VMware, Murad worked with CA Technologies as their Senior Enterprise Solutions Architect. Welcome, Murad.
Thanks, Sujit. Pleasure.
Those who are viewing this can send in questions through the chat box. Shilpa and I will put them to the panelists. Red Hat and VMware are normally fierce competitors, and I'm told it's rare to have them on the same platform. So really glad we have them together. Our idea is not to pit them against each other, but to understand containers and Kubernetes. So let me start with you, Murad. I've read multiple articles and all, Kubernetes made simple and stuff like that, but still don't fully understand containers and Kubernetes. Can you demystify containers and Kubernetes?
Would love to do that, Sujit. In fact, a lot of our customers keep asking us the same question, right? Why do I do containers and what really is a container? In its simplest format, a container is an abstraction for an application. It's like a unit of the application that is abstracted from the underlying hardware, the underlying infrastructure, and that unit called the container is then portable, right? Just imagine a container that you put on the ship, right? You store stuff inside that and then it goes from one place to another. Bring that analogy back to IT and you have a container that contains an application or a part of the application. And then one of the reasons for putting it inside a container is that it is portable. You can run it on any platform. So the developer just codes it once and throws it over to production and says, let's run this. And then because of the container technology, you have the ability to run it literally anywhere, on premise, on the cloud, on the edge, in all of these places, right? So that's a container.
Now, and the container itself has everything that the application requires.
Exactly. It contains the application and whatever, in very simple terms, whatever is required for the application to run and execute successfully is inside that container, right? And it can just be abstracted. Now, the joy starts when the developer just develops the code, puts it inside a container, and tells the production or the operations team, go run this. And then there are aspects around security, scale, resiliency, observability, and so on. So the containers also need someone to shepherd them, right? Like a manager that provides a platform for all these containers to run successfully and do the job that they're supposed to do. So this software is called a container scheduler. And that is where Kubernetes comes in. Kubernetes was actually founded at Google, a little bit of history, in 2014. It was then eventually open sourced, and Kubernetes manages or schedules your containers. It gives a platform that allows these applications inside containers to run successfully, scale out, scale in, be secure, and move from one location to another, right? But yeah, I mean, it's not so tough. Eventually, when you get around to working with containers, for a developer, it's an amazing piece of technology. Once you start getting it into production is when the joy starts.
Okay, okay. Ameeta, relevance of all this for people at large. I mean, how it's made life simple for all of us. What?
Well, just to set a little more, additional context to what Murad already described, for the longest time, organizations have been struggling with how to be more agile, right? Businesses have to be more agile to get their applications to market faster. And in fact, the relevance of that is even more so in the current, pandemic that we find ourselves in, right? So organizations have always struggled with that concept. And interestingly, for several years, we have been talking about the concept of microservices, where organizations have these huge monolithic applications, and there was always the need that let's break it down into more discrete functional units that we call microservices. And this was always a pattern that was available for the developer community. So where the challenge was that it was a developer pattern, and it was not yet, the infrastructure side of it was not yet ready to really implement this in prime time. And that's the reason why we saw, various other patterns come in between, like, services oriented architectures that depended on an enterprise service bus, which again, was very limiting. And now, we are in a situation where this can really take off. And that's the reason why, in addition to what Murad was saying, the fact that today you can take that discrete functional unit, put all the dependencies into that, and then be able to port it. Because today, what is really becoming important is that organizations today are working in a very heterogeneous environment. So they may have bare metal servers, they may have virtualized environments, they may have private clouds, they may have public cloud, they may have more than one public cloud. Now, how do you make sure that application is portable? Because you write once, and then you really want to abstract the developers away from the complexity of which is the environment it's going to run in, right? So back in the day when I had to develop, we always had to wait up for the environments to be able to test our applications. But today, because all those dependencies are within that container, you are making it now a portable unit. Okay. And while it is easier said than done, that take your monolith, break it into microservices, etc., over a period of time, what happens is it becomes a proliferation of microservices, right? And which, finally translates to, you might have several containers. And that is when that orchestration element, becomes extremely important.
Kubernetes.
And that is where, Kubernetes, is come in. And yes, where this is all heading is definitely organizations are seeing a huge uptake, for wanting to become more agile, to be able to change the pieces of their businesses, that need to be agile, right? To be able to quickly respond to business needs, change as required. And that helps them, because if they have brought it down into these discrete functional units, then you make that change without it affecting the rest of the applications, and each of these discrete units can then have a life cycle of its own, and it can have, its own, continuous integration, continuous delivery, as we call it. And then, it becomes so much more easier to manage. And with an orchestration platform like Kubernetes, you are now making sure that it's becoming that much more easier to be able to call, whichever containers that you want, have the right orchestration happening between all of them.
Okay, okay. Feel free to jump in now, Murad, Ameeta, at
Yeah,
any
yeah.
point that you think want to.
I like the point that Ameeta mentioned about container sprawl, right? Eventually, that is what organizations are getting to, right? A bunch of containers all over the place. So getting all of that organized, out of all of that, having visibility into what those containers are doing is becoming critical as customers are getting into production.
So there could be millions of, in a large enterprise could have millions of containers?
Absolutely.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially, yes. Yes.
Yeah. And the whole microservices thing is built around this.
Correct. The concept is the pattern we're talking about in microservices, but then, practically implementable now because of the infrastructure that is surrounding it is really making it now a practical possibility.
Okay, okay. And DevOps also integrally linked to all this?
Absolutely. Because, when you look at DevOps, conceptually it has been around, as long as, organizations, looked at initial waterfall models and then making it more iterative and then coming into agile way of development, DevOps as a concept has been around. But then it is not just about the process part, right? DevOps can really be made practically possible when you also have the automation that will allow everyone. And when we say dev and ops, it's not only dev and ops, right? Today you need to bring the business users together with the developers. You need to bring the testers, you need to get the security folks, you need to get the operations folks, everyone together in a seamless manner, everybody speaking the same language. And that is where underlying automation helps it make a practical possibility. So a lot of times we talk about tools and we talk about processes, but a lot of times we forget that for anything to become practically implementable, the culture element is very important. And that is where the people come into the picture, right? So no technology will, really take off unless, we have the people buy-in behind it. And any technology, we believe will really take off when you have a whole community behind it, a whole ecosystem that is also developing or bought into that particular area. And that is really why we're seeing DevOps, the kind of uptake we're seeing, Kubernetes, because there is this huge ecosystem, there's this huge community behind the entire thing.
Yeah, I just want to build on one aspect that Ameeta spoke about, right? This entire thing around microservices. As we talk to more and more enterprise customers, right, they're very different from a startup whose business is completely centered around technology. But larger organizations, pharma companies, banks and telcos and so on, a lot of them still have what is popularly called technical debt, right? These are applications that have been developed 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And a lot of them are struggling with, do we do this microservices architecture or refactoring of applications, as it is called, for every application that sits there? Do we do all of this overnight? How do we prioritize? So while this concept of microservices is important, we see a lot of customers coming back with a sense of pragmatism, saying, here's where we want to modernize. These are applications that we really believe will be our competitive differentiators in the market. And here's where we start our modernization journey. So we're seeing that discussion, but it doesn't go and get applied throughout the application landscape.
Okay, so you can start small, you're saying. You can start and then slowly expand into other areas.
Absolutely. So typically organizations, would like to look at those parts of their business that require that kind of agility, right? So they would like to first look at those applications that will see change more often. And there could also be certain parts of the application, like Murad said, that are running, that are their systems of record that probably don't need to change immediately, right? So, those they could, keep as it is. So,
Okay.
yeah, so organizations place their bets in terms of aware, but the fact is that every organization is at least having the discussion with us, in terms of, getting on the journey at least, a container adoption journey. But where they start, that ends up being a kind of a journey for them that we work with them to figure out, what parts need to change, what parts need that kind of agility that we were talking about. And, those are the ones that, we work on figuring out what they need to do with it. And sometimes, also a key thing, and since, we have developers in the audience, I just wanted to also touch upon this, that, over a period of time, a number of languages, for developers, have become mainstream, right? And at the same time, there are languages that have kind of sustained over a period of 20, 25 years, etc., just because of the sheer community behind the entire thing, and just because there is so many applications that have been written in that particular language. So sometimes those can become some of the areas that we can work with customers towards. Like, for example, just to give an example, Python has, taken off in a big manner, and, Node.js, several other languages have, gathered steam in the recent years, and we are seeing a lot of developers developing their skills around that. But at the same time, the fact remains that there is a huge number of applications that have been written in Java. These could have been end-tier applications, etc. But it's not like Java has become redundant, but there is an opportunity for us to be able to help developers to be able to make those Java applications more cloud native, more ready, for the cloud. Because when Java had come into being, it had several benefits, and it still does. But probably it was not written with a cloud in mind. So now, when you have that opportunity to do that, there are some very good projects in the open source community, and one of them, for example, is Quarkus, where we are looking at bringing a kind of a framework to Java developers to be able to get their applications up and running very quickly, for a cloud native world.
Okay. Yeah. Just from interest, I mean, for end users like Shilpa and me and all that, what containers and Kubernetes, how does it impact?
For end users, I think,
I mean, as an app user or something.
See, as an end user, you would be a customer to several businesses, right? Whether it is your bank or whether it is, and there are certain services, whether it's from your healthcare provider, and there are certain services that you're expecting. And I think today, with the kind of digital world that we live in, impatience has become the norm, right? You would see that unless, your service provider is able to provide it to you, in a matter of moments, you would not be, satisfied really with the service. And I think with social media being what it is, today, it can become very easy for an organization to lose its brand image very quickly with just, a few, let's say, negative comments on social media, right? So it's a lot of pressure for organizations to be able to bring out those services very quickly, change very quickly what was required, bring up the necessary offers they have to make to their customers very quickly. And that is where I think as an end user, we will all stand to benefit when enterprises are able to bring their applications, their offers, their services, that much more rapidly to customers, no matter where they are, right? And Murad briefly touched upon Edge earlier, with Edge, also being, one of the IT footprints that we're talking about now, where we're having the processing, the services, closer to the edge rather than the data center. Then all the more so that this rapid response and being able to quickly come up to speed with their newer applications is going to become all the more important.
I like that answer, Ameeta, because Sujit, if you ask what's in it for the end user, if you are using your phone, all the goodness that you see with the apps that you download and consume, right? A lot of that is driven with this technology of containers and Kubernetes. Honestly, as an end user, you don't care about how someone is building, managing, and running those applications, right? But eventually, when you use an Uber app and suddenly you see a new payment method, right? Possibly in the backend somewhere, there's a new microservice that got updated without you having to go through a long release cycle and uninstall and reinstall the application. Your app just
like
got
you said,
updated.
WhatsApp. Suddenly the other day I noticed payment was there.
Payment, exactly, right? So that's actually containerization and modern applications at work. That's a classic example of how it benefits users like you and me when it comes to apps. And the challenge is, and I was going back to that enterprise example, right? Try doing this with an enterprise application. We know how long it takes for an enterprise to get an application deployed. They go through multiple cycles. You talk about getting a new feature into production, they've got to go through 4 cycles, start thinking about security and a whole lot of things. How do we make that agility that you're seeing today as a consumer come back to the enterprise?
Earlier we had to reboot our phone and all that, no, in order to get the update and stuff. I guess none of that anymore.
No longer.
No, very interesting. Shilpa?
Murad and Ameeta, if you can talk about how IT professionals are embracing containers and Kubernetes in production environments and the kind of upskilling that's really required for them.
Okay, Ameeta, you want to go first?
Sure. So, Shilpa fundamentally, I believe, for IT professionals or developers, or, no matter what your role is in the organization, right? Fundamentals have not changed. Good design principles have not changed. So following certain best practices in terms of how you go about doing your development, that has not changed. So while there could be sometimes a little bit of that alarm in terms of the number of new technologies that are there out there, and which is that next new shiny object that I need to pick up. The fundamentals, I believe, have still not changed. So all IT professionals will have to look at good principles of, for example, looking at building modularity into their applications, building and that is translating today to whether it is containers or whatever it could be, right? So there is an opportunity for developers, for IT professionals, to be able to look at how they can learn some of these new technologies that can help them to practically implement, as I said, basic principles that are already in place. And that could involve understanding, for example, what it means when we're talking about containerization. What does it mean for a developer if we are talking about Kubernetes as an orchestration platform, right? What does it mean to me as a developer? It could mean something a little different for somebody who's on the IT operations side of things, in terms of what is it that they may need to do in terms of providing that kind of a environment for developers to be able to develop and deploy their containers. So for each one, depending upon where they are, those are the areas that one needs to look at. Let's say you're a business analyst. You need to be able to look at what are these business processes that are there in my company that need to be enhanced, to be improved. And then as a developer, if I get those business requirements, how am I going to look at building that modularity? And then how am I going to do that using containers? And IT operations person will look at how I can deploy this and make it easier for my developers by abstracting that infrastructure away from them. A security person will look at how to build in security right from while there are a lot of tools, and right from the operating system, there's a lot of security that is provided inbuilt through these platforms, etc. But as a security professional, you need to look at how am I going to look at security holistically, in terms of what processes I'm going to build in, what kind of role-based access I'm going to provide, etc. And if I'm a tester, I would need to look at, so depending upon, as an IT professional, what is it that I need to do, certain fundamental principles in place, and then what are the supporting technologies that will help me to achieve that goal. That is something that you would need to work towards. From a Red Hat standpoint, we have been trying to make sure that all these technologies are available in different manners, for depending on how people want to learn. There are websites where you can try it out, like openshift.com/try. There are places where you just want to learn. You can go to learn.openshift.com. Or if you want to go through some proper instructor-led training, then there are a bunch of offerings that we offer that go really hands-on and have some certification exams attached to them as well, so that people can build the necessary credentials if they are building or embarking on their careers and want to take this up as a new thing, right? Kubernetes itself, Murad mentioned, was in 2014 and 2015 is when we at Red Hat also kind of invested in this particular area in the upstream project community. So since then, we realized that the technology itself is just 5 years old. So if I'm going to advertise for people with 10 years experience in Kubernetes, I'm not going to get it, right? So, we have to really look at, how, so IT professionals really will have to look at how they can, quickly scale, build upon what they already know, and kind of scale it to, these areas in terms of understanding what are the best practices of creating containers, using the language of their choice, and then how they're going to make the most of these orchestration platforms, etc. Long answer, but then IT professional is a rather wide, what shall I say?
That's a great response, Ameeta. And I think this was an important question, because while we keep talking about technology and features and benefits and what business wants, I think one of the most under-addressed areas, as I call it, is this entire thing around skill sets and competencies. Because finally, however great your technology is, you still need smart people to run it, right? And this is a problem that we are seeing with a lot of customers. And like Ameeta said, right, there are a bunch of technologies that need to be imbibed by people from an upskilling standpoint. Today, when we talk to our community of vSphere admins, they are talking about, you did a fantastic thing. You actually got Kubernetes inside the hypervisor, right? Now, how do I use my existing skill sets to learn a new technology? There are a lot of them who are coming back and saying, tell us the best resources so that I can get upskilled on this, because my business is asking me to gain this competency. So we've also developed a lot of resources. There's a wonderful site called cube.academy. It talks about a lot of basics. If someone is not really introduced to this world of containers and Kubernetes and wants to start the journey from absolute fundamentals to getting deep dive hands-on with technology, this is a great resource. Almost 2.5 years ago, we acquired a company called Heptio. And two of the co-founders of Kubernetes, Joe Beda and Craig McLachie, are now part of VMware as part of that acquisition. And they've endorsed this education program called Cube Academy. It's free, by the way, right? So just like Red Hat, right? Fantastic resources for people to read up, learn. There's this community called CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, that also offers certification courses, because eventually you learn a lot, right? But for you to prove your credibility, there are certifications, like Ameeta said. So there's a CKA, there's a certified Kubernetes administrator, certified Kubernetes application developer, a security professional. So there's enough and more that the community overall needs to upskill themselves to that level when it comes to deploying all of this in production.
What about a fresh graduate? Sorry,
Yeah.
You wanted to finish something?
Yeah, I just wanted to finish on this topic of this term called platform engineers or site reliability engineers. I think that's a term that a lot of enterprises will have to take up seriously, because that really forms this amalgamation of developers and operations. And I'll go back to Google, right? The way they actually defined this term called a site reliability engineer. And they said, we will have software engineers do operations for us. That's an amazing thought, right? Because typically software engineers are into programming, coding, scripting, and all of that. And then there's a separate team that does operations, looks at infrastructure. But they defined this term saying, we'll get software engineers to do operations. And that's a very smart thing to do. And this is what enterprises are realizing today. And you were talking about roles, Shilpa, right? So these are some of the interesting roles that are coming up around being an SRE or a platform engineer that gets the developers and operations people together as a concept.
Right. And just to add one more skill that will be required, fundamentally, containers are Linux. So that's the technology that is underlying, that allows you to actually package and isolate your applications with their entire runtime, right, and all the files necessary to run. So one of the things that is a prerequisite for people if they are enrolling for any of these courses that I talked about is a good solid understanding of Linux, because that becomes extremely important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a follow-up thing. I mean, for a fresh graduate, can he quickly get on to containers and fresh engineering graduate? Containers and Kubernetes. These are things that they learn in college now, or no, still not? They
do. There are many of these concepts being introduced at the college level itself. And it's as good, so since, like I mentioned, right, there are not too many people who have, a lot of years of experience. So a fresh graduate can very well start, on this journey with learning, how to go about developing, containers.
Yeah. I agree, but a slightly different point of view, right? And this goes back to, Ameeta, what you said initially. this also requires certain fundamentals to be in place. So if you do not have those core fundamentals of how infrastructure operates or how clouds operate and so on, right? Just learning Kubernetes and containers is going to be difficult. So I think that foundation of what you said, right? Linux or fundamentals of infrastructure, along with fundamentals of what we spoke about as Kubernetes and containers, is extremely important. Because when you run into issues, how quickly can you troubleshoot? Those fundamentals need to be there, especially when it comes to networking and security, which in itself is a massive topic when it comes to containers and Kubernetes. There's a lot to learn and read up there.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. So, if we presume that some of those fundamentals they are learning, as part of their core curriculum, then I think, definitely they can build on this. Yeah.
Shilpa?
Challenges in terms of adoption? Is it more mindset or is it technology? If you can share your thoughts on that.
Okay, let me have a go at this first. So there are challenges. Let's not kid ourselves, right? For a developer who's developing code on their laptop and putting it inside a container, it's very easy and it's amazing, right? Because all of that is eventually going to get abstracted. The job is to write code and throw it over the wall. And I said this initially when we started the conversation, right? That is where fun starts, because when you want an application which is containerized to run in production, there are several aspects that typically a developer does not bother about, right? There are things around resiliency, there are things around scale, there's networking, there's security, there's observability, there's troubleshooting, and then very quickly getting that feedback back to the developer. And this is exactly one of the reasons why Kubernetes and a host of other projects around Kubernetes were developed, to mitigate some of these challenges that potentially one would anticipate in production environments. And how do you then close that loop of DevOps, right? Because DevOps, if you look at it, is a closed loop. The developer develops, puts it into operations very quickly. There's feedback on what's going wrong, new capabilities to be developed, and then it becomes an agile loop, right? How do you make that really happen in enterprise? Because honestly, enterprises are not used to this speed of DevOps, right? So you're right. It's one thing is a mindset, a skill set, a competency conversation. The second one is around technology. What technology you need to put in place for these kind of applications to be successful.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And then, fundamentally, I think then the role of the architects become very important in terms of, how they plan, the way they're going to, structure their entire, cloud transformation, or rather the digital transformation journey, by making the best of this in terms of bringing agility, right? So from a developer standpoint, really, from our experience, no two developers really work in exactly the same way. So if we are able to help them build with speed, agility, confidence, and choice, which means, the code that goes into production mode, wherever they choose to build it, and, be able to provide them, the kind of hosted environment that they would need in their production, right there on their laptops. Those are some of the ways where you can actually give the best tools for developers to work with. And with operations, they basically need to look at enterprise security to make it sure it is stable and scalable, right? And bring the kind of consistency so that wherever you're operating, whichever is that environment or infrastructure, you're looking at it, and then look at how they deploy it. So the way I would look at it is hard, but the way you can enable your developers is by making sure that across the software development life cycle, we give them as much of self-service capabilities as possible, right? So that every time the operations is not called upon to deploy some unfamiliar infrastructure, just so that that software pipeline is enabled, right? So the important thing is bringing the entire team together so that you can unify your teams and really be able to shift your business. Because end of the day, it is all about how quickly you can bring innovation out there to your customers, and how easy we can make it for. So Kubernetes, is already, we have this whole community behind it, a whole ecosystem behind it. So by itself, it is not hard. But where we have seen the challenges is when, Kubernetes has its own life cycle, right? So every 90 days or so, it gets updated. And then Kubernetes is for your container orchestration. But there are a lot of other projects that feed into it. For example, service mesh, to look at how the services are communicating with each other. You have some other project like Prometheus, which is monitoring the services. You have something else. So, there are a whole lot of projects that feed into Kubernetes, and each one of them has its own life cycle. So sometimes being able to keep pace with all those changes that are happening is where sometimes, organizations struggle a little bit if they go with, the vanilla Kubernetes. And that is really the opportunity where, organizations like Red Hat are trying to bridge that gap by giving that completely integrated platform so that, people can focus on what they do best and, not get bogged down by the nitty-gritties of, the upgrades, the patches, and everything else that will have to, be done.
Okay.
That's right. And I think that's the default expectation from enterprises, right? A lot of customers that we speak to tell us Kubernetes is great, but make it consumable for the enterprise. And exactly what you said, right, Ameeta?
Exactly.
They don't want to deal with upgrades, updates, discrete components. They're saying, make it a simple package that I can consume and manage all of this for us.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay. There's some questions coming in from the audience, and just a reminder to the audience, the comment section, in case you want to ask questions to Ameeta and Murad, please in the comment section, you can send in your questions. So the Mahipal Reddy has this interesting question. How are the opportunities for QA professionals in Kubernetes-based roles? What is the required skill set? Did you get that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me take a quick dig at that. So a QA professional, a developer, these are people who typically test or develop software, right? Someone who does quality assurance. Typically what happens is that they end up going to IT and say, give me infrastructure on which I can deploy the software and run my quality assurance tests. Now we are getting into a world where this no longer happens. Be it a developer or a tester or a QA professional, they just use APIs to go and request for these Kubernetes clusters, as we call them, and they just deploy software on it using APIs and do their testing and the test cases of quality assurance. So one of the skill set that a QA professional should have is this ability to understand this new piece of infrastructure called Kubernetes. Honestly, if you ask me what is Kubernetes, it is infrastructure that allows you to run containers on it. That's as simple as it gets, right? So get those skill sets and be ready for the future, because this is what is going to come to you. Your developers are going to create software that is containerized, that runs on Kubernetes, right? So when they hand it over to you for QA, you should be ready for that.
Okay. Ameeta, you want to add to that?
Yeah. So, from a QA standpoint, there is a lot that we try to do to make the lives a little easier, from the product standpoint itself. Because when upstream projects happen and we bring them downstream as products, there is a level of quality assurance that, we do. And therefore, there is some amount of, integration that will happen between, various products of stack. But the QA job becomes extremely important, and that's the reason why I believe that has to be an integral part of whatever are the key roles that come together in the DevOps. While I mentioned earlier that we talk about DevOps as a generic term, but there are so many other roles that fall into that entire thing, right? So that is a substantial area of focus that gets into the specifics of the containers and the applications that are running within them that need to be thoroughly tested out before they go into production. So so there is a significant role that the QAs will have to pay on any issues that will slip through, because then the repercussions will be there, right, in terms of whatever software gets deployed.
Shilpa?
Yeah, there's this question from Divyanshu. You spoke about the importance of Linux fundamentals. As one of the distributors of Linux through Red Hat Enterprise Linux, what is Red Hat's role in the overall Kubernetes ecosystem and the Linux integration?
Okay. Okay, so that's an interesting question. So the role that Red Hat has been primarily around, making open source more consumable for our enterprise customers, right? So from that point of view, we participate. There are a whole lot of developers from Red Hat who are only tasked with participating in several of those upstream open source community projects that Red Hat is leading or contributing to. So there are several projects, within the CNCF framework that, Red Hat is either playing a leading role or a leading contributor to, including Kubernetes, right? So while Google has been the one that actually open sourced Kubernetes, ever since Red Hat, kind of backed this project and has been, instrumental in, bringing that out to the market, right? As one of a key technology that, we are putting a lot of our resources behind. So there are several of those projects, including Fedora, for Linux, and, several other upstream projects that you would have heard of, that translate into downstream projects that we work on. So whether it is Istio for service mesh or Knative for serverless, or any of the related technologies, we are wherever we are placing our big bets on, we are making sure that we are participating. And then when we are bringing it downstream, we make sure that it goes through the required hardening, the required QA, the required steps that we need to make go through to make sure that we are making it enterprise grade for our customers to consume, which means we bring in that level of stability that, Sujit, you mentioned earlier, so that, enterprise customers don't have to worry about what were the original underlying upstream projects and, whether they are updated to the latest versions, whether they'll all work together. That integration, that, hardening, and those security checks are what we do. And we also make sure that we take the customer advocacy back to the open source community, which means, the feedback that customers give us on our products, goes back as feedback to the upstream community so that, the projects can get better and, incorporate the kind of things that the enterprises are looking for. I hope I've answered that question.
So there's this question from Venugopal. May I know the difference between Dockerizing an app and containerizing an app? Are they both same or different? Murad, you want to take that?
So I'll take that. Yeah, technically it's the same. Docker is the company that actually came up with this runtime to execute containers, right? So people use that term loosely. So Dockerizing is essentially using a Docker runtime to run those containers. So essentially it is containerization, and the right term today is containerization.
Okay. Okay. And in your case, you run Kubernetes on VMware, is it? On virtual machines? Sorry, not VMware.
We run Kubernetes everywhere. We can run it on the cloud. We can run it on VMs. We can also run it on bare metal. It's the customer's choice. But typically what we have seen is, and there's a point of view, right? We've seen a lot of customers, a lot of providers. If you look at some of the public cloud providers, and each one of them has a managed offering around Kubernetes, right? Be it Google, AWS, Azure, all of them provide it inside a layer of virtualization. And there are merits of doing it, right? Around security, around isolation, around the ability to rapidly spawn out what we call worker nodes and expand or scale out the application. But then there are some, from a point of view, that choose to deploy Kubernetes on bare metal x86 servers. So it's the customer's choice. The CNCF actually defines that level of abstraction that you can literally run it anywhere. But yeah, we've seen a lot of our customers run it inside VMs. And like I said earlier, what we've done now is VMware is known as this vSphere company, right? It's a hypervisor that's been one of the most prevalent pieces of technology in data centers. What we did was we took the goodness of Kubernetes and put it inside the hypervisor. So what Kubernetes got to containers can now also be applied to virtual machines that run on top of this hypervisor. But a very simple answer to your question, Sujit, you could just run containers anywhere.
Anyway, okay. Shilpa?
Yeah, we have this question from Nagraj. How can I utilize Kubernetes from database management system point of view?
Ameeta, you want to take that and then I'll talk through.
Can you elaborate a bit on what you mean?
So this question.
Okay, let me put it this way. When you work with, Kubernetes or with containers, there are certain capabilities that your applications will bring. And many times, we end up having the containers that are spawned and, as required, and then, they are destroyed as required, right? And depending upon events, you could kind of scale up and scale down. So you could look at having additional capabilities that are available from the point of view of data that needs to be able to persist, through certain applications that services that can provide you those on the side.
I just have one thing to add. My only advice is do not containerize because you need to containerize, right? Understand whether that workload, we call it a workload, right? It's a large database. Does it really need to get containerized? Like Ameeta said, a container is typically something that's tiny, that's spawned off quickly, that has the ability to scale out. It's got a particular characteristic, right? A large monolithic enterprise database is not one of those workloads, unless you're planning in your mind saying, here's how I intend to break down my application, microservice, split that database, shard it, and so on, right? But yeah, typically containerizing a database is a longer conversation and needs a lot more detailing.
Yeah,
nobody would normally do it, is it?
And
they would, but yeah, there are constraints around this. I wouldn't take something as is and start running it inside containers and say that, you know what, I've got containerization done. My next question to that person or that organization would be, so what did you achieve? Did you get anything out of it? And you would know the answer then.
Right. And now we have the concept of operators as well in Kubernetes, that can help you to actually look at, adding the database itself as, deploying it, separately.
Okay, I have a question which you kind of answered it, but let me put it anyway. Nipun Mukherjee is asking this: as a developer who's currently not using Kubernetes, how can I or my team or my organization benefit from adapting it? I know you kind of answered it earlier, but
yeah. So sooner or later, your business is going to ask you to upscale, because upskill and upscale, on Kubernetes and containers, because that is what they will use to develop new applications. Today, if you talk to any organization that's developing new applications for their digital channels, right, their outreach to their customers, typically you would find that it is based on modern technology like containers and Kubernetes. And then going back to developers and seeing whether they are skilled up, whether they need someone else. So I think it is a tremendous opportunity for developers to very quickly start looking at this new technology and have the ability to skill up, get those competencies, get those certifications.
It's inevitable. It's inevitable. I mean, you have to go to containers and Kubernetes.
Absolutely. In fact, you will see a rise of a lot of Kubernetes native software, with people building with Kubernetes in mind. And we're seeing this increasingly, across customers, large enterprises, built, on the cloud, whatever, the...
Like what? Can you give an example? Build with Kubernetes in mind. What does that mean?
When I say built with Kubernetes in mind, you start that as a design concept, to say that I'm going to build cloud native, I'm going to containerize my application, and I'm going to use Kubernetes to orchestrate, right? So build that as a design principle itself. We will see increasingly a lot of that. We've seen, for example, in the FSI sector with this whole UPI, right, which became absolutely indispensable in this era of contactless banking, etc. A lot of these services increasingly, customers are looking at containerizing and looking at bringing these services faster. So it is becoming, I would say, a default choice, for all cloud native development going forward, and for customers that are looking on a transformation journey of how they're going to go about doing this adopting. So to answer, his question, it is inevitable, especially if his organization is in the business of, developing software either for themselves or for others, right? They will find that increasingly the end customers are asking for this, or, within their organization, they will find the need to be able to do this.
If I have the skills, how long would it take for me to containerize something that was not previously containerized?
Okay. So if you have the skills, how long it would take? So it would depend on, yeah, it is very subjective. It will depend upon the application that has to be, containerized. Okay. Understanding how well you understand that application. If you understand that application very well, then, being able to develop it in a cloud native manner, containerizing, becomes that much more easier.
That easier. Okay.
Just one point to add there. Again, remember, you do not need to change the entire application. There are customers who have said, this tier of the application is really critical for me to scale out because that's customer facing. I want to modernize this part of the application. And that's what we call a hybrid application, right? Part of it sits on bare metal or sits on virtual machines, and a part of it is modernized and containerized. So it really depends on the complexities of that application, the dependencies that it has, and so on. But to give you some examples, we've seen some customers do this very, very rapidly. Because if you don't do it, you are actually losing out on a market opportunity to address a particular customer segment or that opportunity. So the speeds can be dizzying, if I can call it that.
Okay. So UPI would be containerized. I mean, is it on containers or what? Would you know?
It depends on, the specific banks and how they're adopting. Some of them definitely are.
Okay.
And some of the ISVs who develop the UPI software are also on this path of taking their existing software and breaking it down and making it more modular, or in simple words, containerized, and taking it to the banks and telling them, here's the new avatar of this application, and here's what it brings to your business in terms of scale.
Okay. Shilpa?
Yeah, this question is coming from Lakshmi Priya. What is a headless service and what does it exactly do? I have read up online, but still unclear about it.
What is it? Headless?
Yeah, what is a headless service and what does it exactly do? I've read up online, but I'm still unclear about it.
Do you know what?
So let me take a shot at that, right? So typically a headless service is also referred to as a function or a serverless kind of an infrastructure, right? Where it does not have the standard functions of an application in terms of a front end and so on, right? Which is why it is called headless. And typically these are consumption patterns. And I'll give you an example so that it becomes simple, right? So I take a photograph and I want to convert it. Now there are 10 different applications that may want to use this conversion capability. We call it a function, right? So there is this thing called a function being delivered as a service, right? It is also sometimes getting into the domain of what we call serverless, because it doesn't really persist throughout. An application goes and consumes it when required and comes out. And that's what you eventually as a business end up paying for, right? I have 25 photos to get converted. I just pass it to that function. The function comes up, does the conversion and goes away, right? And I get my outcome. So there are these capabilities that I don't need to sit and build inside my application. I just go and consume some of those, right? And there are various services, including Kubernetes, that allows you to deliver some of these using this project called Knative that Ameeta spoke about briefly. That is something that can be used for serverless functions, if I can call it that.
Okay. Which industries are adopting Kubernetes and containers the fastest? Anything along that line?
Across industries.
Yeah.
You name them, they are all looking at it in some manner or the other. And I would say every industry is today, literally become a software company, right? So everybody is, so I can give you examples from automotive, from FSI, from healthcare to, oil and gas exploration. And, there's several,
Okay.
across, I would say.
Okay.
Telcos used to very specifically run their functions of delivering telecom services like voice and data inside these big, thick appliances, right? That they used to rack and stack. Today, a lot of those got converted into software that runs on standard commodity x86 servers, as we call them. And a lot of those are also getting containerized. So telco is a huge consumer of these Kubernetes services.
And
Okay.
to add, Sujit, government as well, because several digital initiatives are very, very specifically they're looking at using containers and.
Okay. I have this question from Ashwin. Does containerization of existing applications result in data security issues?
If you don't manage it well, absolutely. And I think we covered this earlier in the section, right? There's this entire concept called zero trust security. And it applies to all pieces of your infrastructure, right? Whether you run something in your data center as a virtual machine or you run an application on the cloud, it essentially says that a component of your application needs to be isolated and should communicate with another component only when it needs to. This is a fundamental principle of security. And this absolutely applies to containerized applications or modern applications as well. So if you do not take care of all of these security fundamentals when you're developing your application, and I think Ameeta covered this earlier, right? When you're building your application, you've got to have that security mindset, saying, I will build this application grounds up with security, which is intrinsic, it's built in. I don't need to bolt on security, right? So it's a very, very important aspect and needs to be considered, and which is where these enterprise Kubernetes flavors, as we call it, deliver that level of security inside it. They provide what the upstream Kubernetes cannot deliver when it comes to networking and security. Very critical.
Okay. Shilpa, do you have any questions?
Yeah, this question is from Venu. May I know if Kubernetes has a coverage to build CI/CD pipeline good enough for building deployments, or if it requires external integration with DevOps tools to achieve build and deployments?
Yeah, so at the fundamental level, there is a level of seamlessness that comes in with Kubernetes orchestration platforms like OpenShift, right, which helps to unify developers and operators. On top of that, you can bring in complementary automation technologies that can actually help to make that whole DevOps seamless, because you may have so many other tools in your environment, right, that you need to use from the point of view of your servers, your networks, for your security, and so many other things, right? If you're able to build, use, let's say, an automation platform like an Ansible, for example, then you can actually make DevOps completely seamless and smooth by writing the right playbooks to be able to call various modules of whichever are the other underlying tools. But having a common language, automation language really helps, and having a common platform helps to be able to unify the entire team. That's a short answer to it.
Okay. So last week with JFrog, we were discussing this whole notion of liquid software. I mean, so what? We are heading in that direction, containers and Kubernetes and all kind of making it all seamlessly flow. Is it software?
Absolutely. In fact,
composable is the new word.
Sorry?
Composable is the new word, right? You
composable.
Compose software on demand. So it goes back to that term that you use, right? Fluid or liquid. Goes where the demand is and scales out when required, scales in, and gives that infrastructure back into the pool. That is what the business is headed towards.
Okay. Ameeta, you're saying something?
No, I was just echoing.
Okay. So these are all becoming in words now, is it? Okay. Okay, that's it. I mean, questions I think are done. Yeah, Sodamsi says yes. Okay, great discussion. Yeah, much more clarity into containers and Kubernetes. Thanks so much, Ameeta. Thanks so much, Murad. Look forward to more interactions in coming days.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, containers, Kubernetes really happening. Everybody will probably will need it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure being on this.
Bye.
Thank you.